So the topic of today's conversation is what is commonly referred to as a crackdown on the tech industry in China. But I think it's worth just taking a closer look on the language here, because I'm not sure that this is actually a crackdown. And if yes, what kind? And it also clearly does not really affect the entire tech industry. So there are certain parts of the tech industry that are more affected than others. So maybe let's just start here. If I had spent the last 6 months in Antarctica, or some other place where the Wi-Fi is not great, and I had no idea what was going on, how would you sort of start to explain to me what is actually happening right now, what has happened?
Sure.
And we have a few slides, I think, as well to help with that explanation.
It's good that you mentioned Antarctica, because I'm going to use the metaphor of weather to describe the last, I would say 8 months, I guess, or basically end of October, we'll talk about this, and maybe we'll go to just some slides as to kind of inventory of the various weather systems that have been moving through the Chinese tech and more generally governance in China. It's definitely been ratcheting up. If you have, we have somewhere Xi Jinping's works, it's about governance, right? So we have previously, let's say, an analog governance model, which is now trying to become increasingly digital. And yet, who got there first was the private sector entrepreneurs, the big tech companies, as we now call them in the US, in Europe, although European big tech companies are American, that's another story. But in China, they are Chinese big tech companies, but they're private sector. They were founded, and I moved to Beijing, as you mentioned, 94. The internet was just connecting then in academic circles. By 96, we had sort of dial-up and the early internet players. There was no Ministry of Internet. There was no regulatory system to start an internet company. There were different branches of government, but these, almost like hothouse flowers, these seeds that were planted, grew to such an extent that they, disrupted huge swathes of the Chinese economy and society. So this is the challenge that the Leninist instincts of the Communist Party, of course, is dealing with: how to regain control, let's say, over an area that was pretty much laissez-faire. I mean, kind of Wild West, even compared to the West in some areas. The amount of leeway that these entrepreneurs had was stunning, and the scale which they've achieved is greater even than what we think of, with Google or Apple or others. Right. So that's the book, and that was actually 2017. I think I was here in Asia Society, Switzerland, down by the train station, right, in a brew pub, I think. Yes, wonderful event. And this was the future of digital China seen from 2017. So you're not yet in Antarctica, but things looked pretty rosy back then. We'd had the IPO of Alibaba a few years prior. It was the biggest IPO in history. They were already thinking about the IPO of their financial arm, Ant, and we'll talk about that. Ant Financial, Ant Group was planned. And that's when if you went to Antarctica a day before the IPO of Ant, then you wouldn't know what was happening. So if we go to the next slide, and I hope everybody can see this on Zoom at home. So the last chapter of my book included a hedge, because when you write a book about a company or an individual, you sort of have to think, oh my God, what happens? It takes about 6 or 8 months minimum before, after you finish writing the book, that it actually comes out. And so I thought, well, inevitably, we all had the sense that Jack Ma had achieved a sort of outsized role in China as an icon of the private sector, of technology, but also already had started to encounter some resistance, definitely from the government. And I describe in the previous chapter 11, which is about Ant and the creation of Alipay, which is basically displaced cash. And literally for the 10 months I was just in China, 9 months, I didn't touch cash once in the whole time. So that's partly to do with Ant, it's partly to do with Tencent, but he's an iconic figure, clearly. The legend of Icarus, we all know, is about the wax wings. I used to joke, Jack Ma could buy the wax wings on Taobao, if he needed them. It's not just about flying too close to the sun. We know that. It's also about not flying into the sea, the Mediterranean, in this case, off Crete. He unexpectedly, things got much more dramatic than either sun or sea. And if we go to the next slide, I think we'll sort of start to see what happened. So it's more like there have been multiple lightning strikes happening every day almost since you arrived in Antarctica, the end of October. And he was definitely the first big lightning strike that the government, by suspending the Ant IPO just days before it was going to happen, would have been, again, the largest IPO in the world since his own, and maybe one other. It would have been in Shanghai and Hong Kong. It was very useful, actually, to buttress investor sentiment about Hong Kong, to demonstrate Shanghai's rise as a very reputable bourse, for investors. And yet it was sacrificed, this whole story. The next slide, I think we'll see the speech that Jack Ma gave, a fateful speech of 24th of October, 2020. This is when the Icarus starts to really kick in. What he said at this speech was not new in the sense that he probably, I think, pretty much covered all of the elements he covered in that speech before, but he put them all together and he addressed an audience of regulators, particularly from People's Bank of China, securities regulators, current regulators, retired regulators, pretty influential members of government. And he basically started by criticizing global financial regulation, including central banks and just the anachronisms of Basel and various things. But he launched then on into critiques of regulation in China. So he sort of crossed a line there. Already, one could argue he's being a bit provocative, that's the point of being him, about the international, sort of the global financial regulation. But then he didn't really have a firewall when he launched into criticizing regulation in China and the banks. He literally said things like, you guys know how to run, a port, but I'm the airport here. You're the past. Step aside. Now, when I've just met most of you, I don't intend to insult you individually during this. That's stand-up comedy. You pay for that. You expect that, right? Jack Ma, and I describe in the book, he knows how to read the room, like a comedian. He changes his bits, his little speeches to adapt to the room. This was a spectacular example of not reading the room. And there's some questions why he did it. And people speculate that he knew that regulations were coming, including tighter controls of online lending. And Alipay, by the way, is an essential app for life in China. And it was increasingly not just payments, but it was loans. I could borrow a loan in a microsecond based on all the information that Alibaba had about me. And this was basically growing both for loans to individuals and to companies. The speculation about this IPO was insane. People were borrowing money, trillions of dollars to get into this IPO. The government was getting very, very nervous. And so at the last minute, they basically issued rules that would effectively make the IPO impossible. And the question is, did he or did he not know that? Did he know it and say, look, I've got nothing to lose? Anyway, so that was a very dramatic Icarus moment for him when the sun was shining high. He was hit by lightning and crashed into the sea. And, sadly, is a figure that, is of great entertainment, has not really been heard from since. He's been seen, but he's not heard from. He's on mute. So that was dramatic. And then people were speculating, is that it? It's just about Jack. And people still say, well, he's such an outsized figure. But if we go on a little bit, we'll just quickly go through so I don't have to be in presentation mode. But if we talk about the platform economy, which Alibaba is, and there's too much, there's a lot of text here. You'll get more and more text as we go through this because text is becoming more important in China. Regulations are coming out. New regulatory bodies emerging, like the State Administration Market Regulation, a massive, $2.7 billion fine, European Commission level style fine, which hadn't been seen before. Cyberspace Administration of China, an internet body that was powerful, is coming back. But anyway, if we go forward, because I see a spelling mistake, it then started to go into Tencent gaming. And just this morning, the Chinese government announced further restrictions on gaming companies, online gaming companies, to publish new games. So Tencent shares are down, I think, 8% overnight. That is the largest, I think still the largest company by market cap in Asia. Maybe not anymore. Because, if a gaming company can't publish games, it's a problem. I mean, they have many other businesses, but they've also been hit in music and food delivery. They have many investments we'll talk about. And this follows an earlier restriction, which I mentioned here, that game players under the age of 18 are now restricted to an hour of play on Fridays and weekends and holidays only. Now, parents in the room may love this, or they may hate it because then they have to talk to their children, which is maybe more scary. No, sorry. But anyway, it's been interesting. This story about the gaming restrictions has started to gain traction outside China. We've had, parents or more conservative leaning elements, even in the US. Fox News was featuring, we need to learn from China about their regulations of the tech sector. also because of their dislike of certain social media companies. So some of this stuff is like China is doing stuff that many people have thought about in terms of regulating big tech. To your point, this is not just about the Chinese specifics of regulation of tech. There's a global issue about big tech and how big is. And so we are seeing some of this filtering in, but it started with Jack when you were in Antarctica, and it continued and it keeps going. I'll just run through just to give you a sense. I'm not going to give you an exhaustive list because it's literally adding by the hour. Just firstly, Tencent and Alibaba, including Ant below it, are investors in so many other companies, including, we'll talk about Didi, Pinduoduo, you name it. They're co-investors in a number of these companies. So hitting Alibaba and Tencent has much wider implications for the economy. And these companies are, deeply embedded in larger areas of the economy than we could have ever imagined. So next slide, we'll just go into, so being a tech entrepreneur today in China is sort of like this. This is like, I think the old BBC weather icons. What do you do? This is your weather forecast for today. It's like, basically they've been hit by regulations left and right. There was a great talk yesterday. Kevin Rudd was participating with Nico and I think, who else? Jim McGregor, which I recommend to you, talking about the implications. And some people are relatively zen about entrepreneurs will always adapt, and actually it's true that Alibaba and Tencent were so big, and we could say also ByteDance and maybe Didi, that there was a risk of crushing of competition. And this is a discussion in Silicon Valley as well, right? You buy a company to put it out of business, right? However, it depends on your view of how much risk is acceptable. Yes, we need risk. Entrepreneurs, that's what they do. They deal with risk. But when it becomes flashing lights, conflicting signals, we have to see. We haven't seen the impact yet of all these regulations, and they're coming out almost hourly now. We have different bodies. It's definitely a new regime. So we'll just finish up on the slides and we can chat. Ride hailing, this is the Didi. We saw after the IPO. So Ant was stopped from going public. It has not gone public. That those investors are still kind of stuck in that business, and the valuation is definitely lower, for this fintech company. Didi did go public, but within days, the government came out with new rules on data security, and so we saw 20% drop in the share price a few days after the IPO. What does that mean in America? Lawsuits. It's a great opportunity for lawyers. So people previously had said, well, the Chinese government obviously wants to maintain access to capital, and they do, and they will. But this was somewhat surprising that this thing, with the Ant thing, again, they stopped this company going public. And Ant may have had huge problems had it gone public because of these new regulations. But in this case, Didi, and the story is that Didi just went ahead. They knew regulations were coming again, but in their case, they just forced it through. And we've seen huge sanctions on the company since then. Now, who was pushing that? Was it Masayoshi Son from SoftBank, who's since announced he's no longer investing in China tech? Was it management? It's unclear. Quickly finishing up, and then we'll talk. So basically, you can read through, difficulties for tech companies to list overseas if they have large numbers of customers, which they all want. Above 1 million or so customers, they cannot list in the US. The question is, can they list in Hong Kong? If they're going to list domestically, there's now talk of a Beijing stock exchange that never existed before. What about Shanghai and Shenzhen? Education, if you invested in these online education companies, they've been decimated. Entertainment, the whole sector has been hit with huge restrictions on individuals. And basically the government stepping up, as I said, like they want to limit the impact of fan culture, chaotic culture, we mentioned sharing economy, even, there's bike sharing, home sharing. I think Airbnb is now banned in Beijing, for example. Battery packs, which in China you always need, because if you don't have cash, you need your phone charged. There's all these battery pack sharing companies, even they have been hit by restrictions. So cloud computing, and the list goes on. So let's finish with that. I think we're kind of done, but basically where are we headed? It's sort of the filter through which you see these changes. Some see an ideological, communist versus private capitalism. Others see need for greater control. It's open season for interpretation.
Yeah.
We can recommend people to Kevin Rudd's speech yesterday when he talks about a leftward swing in politics in Xi's first administration, and a leftward swing in economy, and a rightward swing in nationalism. Yeah. That was his sort of general things. And it's a very good speech, and it's I think 20 pages PDF we can share. And
there's also an online version where he actually gives the speech, and we can send out the video afterwards. I think that's a good wider context to today's conversation. So thank you, Duncan, for this ride. I feel caught up now after having returned from Antarctica. I'm not sure if I wanted to return.
The weather was better there. Yeah.
At least it didn't change as much. Let me maybe try to, because I think it's always with these things, it's sort of, there's a lot going on. It's hard to unpack, as you say, it's open for interpretation. So let's maybe, I think one thing that sort of I took from what you said is, there's not just one industry affected, there's several, but there's also, it's kind of like, let's maybe just pause for a moment to kind of acknowledge who's not yet affected, right? So we're not seeing Huawei, which has been in the news a lot over the recent years, like they're not in trouble yet domestically, they're in trouble elsewhere.
Quite the opposite.
We're not seeing the semiconductor industry. So this is, when we look at the tech industry, this is, it's the consumer facing people, it's the really large companies, it's not sort of the hardware industry, it's not sort of the backbone. And we can get to why that may be important. So there's an interpretation on that. So I do want to talk maybe briefly on sort of on intent, right? So what are the regulators, the Chinese government thinking when they do this? And then we can talk about sort of desired and maybe undesired effects. But the question that I was struck by while you were speaking, so you talked about Jack Ma, who's usually good in reading the room. You talked about Didi possibly just pushing ahead despite knowing that regulations were coming. I think there's this sense here when we look at China to kind of assume that business and industry leaders and political leaders are all, sort of like they all know each other. They talk. It's just basically the same small group of people. And so I find it quite striking that apparently it was like a pretty big misunderstanding, right? So the Jack Ma and the leaders of Didi probably were not aware, even if they were aware that regulations were coming, may not have been fully aware of the effect. So can you talk about sort of the source of this misunderstanding? What's the disconnect here?
So in chapter 11 of my book, which came out again 5 years ago, but I do go through when Jack Ma took control of Alipay into his own personal hands. So this company, Alipay, was part of Alibaba and Jack took it out. It was quite controversial at the time, but he kind of got away with it. And he did that by playing off, frankly, different parts of the regulatory system. So you had different factions within the People's Bank of China. He's had other disputes with other commercial bodies, regulatory bodies. So there was a long period where the regulators were on the back foot because, frankly, it was unclear what their turf was, or they were competing, or there was, constant personnel changes. So I think that these entrepreneurs had just, become sense that they were immune to, that they were superior than this regulatory system. They knew how to play the game. And of course, when you've raised, billions of dollars from investors, that's what you tell them. And that's what they're basically placing a bet on you, which is why we see some of the princelings, daughters, nieces, sons of, red aristocratic families, with strong communist links, to basically be that guide. Things have changed clearly because things that we thought would never be possible are now possible. And why? I mean, all that I've described is kind of the micro, effects of these regulations. But what is really driving this? Take a step back. China has a demographic crisis, as we know, by having ended the one-child policy and then promoted now the two-child policy and now the three-child policy, because China is facing a massive aging. I think barely 10 million babies were born in China last year in a country of 1.4 billion. Why? One big area is property prices, which is now perhaps the next big sacred cow that people have thought had never be touched because taxing property would be, going at the heart of class, in China. But there's a lot of resentment in China because a lot of young people cannot ever afford to buy a place. They'll not be young people by the time they can afford. They may not ever be able, 60 years, they can make the calculation if they're working, particularly in, let's say, a tech job where they're, 9 to 9, 6 days a week, this 996 culture, and they're only earning X, and the minimum, mortgage would be 3X, So the Chinese government or the Communist Party clearly is understanding the need to incorporate more populist policies, which, by the way, is a global phenomenon in terms of, populism or the frustrations that younger people are feeling. So why I mentioned the three-child policy, which is not really a policy, but sort of a recommendation, is this education crackdown. These are training companies that were providing maths and science classes and others on the side for junior to keep up, in class. And by the way, junior could be 3-4 years old. It doesn't matter. They're expensive, these classes. Yes, they access great teachers in some cases and sometimes overseas teachers. But the burdens on Chinese parents, and you've all read about this, are just intense. So you have very expensive property, you have increasing fees on the side of, supposedly free state education, and there's actually a lot of fees involved in local schooling. Basically, the burdens of it, nobody could afford to have a second child or even a first child at this point. So, of course, cracking down on an area which seemed to be profiting from this or contributing to this is to some extent popular, although it may also have unexpected effects. Like people are now saying, look, it doesn't matter. I don't need to go through an online platform. I'll just hire personally, a tutor to come in. And, so it's very controversial right now, like the cost of raising housing, clothing kids, and that is a major challenge for the Communist Party. So you can actually see the logic if you take a step back and think about the problems that China has. Also loans, if they were getting out of control, the state banks, of course, should be there to make loans to individuals, but they've never been very good at that. The tech guys came in with algorithms and had superior information. But unregulated, you could have a consumer finance explosion, which would be very damaging. So it's all about stability. It all comes back to long-term stability of the country and the party. And anything that seems to diminish that could be subject to severe regulation, as we've seen with gaming. People think about addiction or it's interrupting their studies, So it's kind of father knows best. It's not really mother anymore. It's quite paternal, So you kind of need to go back to 1950s. Watch those, black and white TV shows. Honey, I'm home. Dinner's on the table. That's kind of where we're heading. Chinese society isn't there actually. Chinese society is much more nuanced, and it's fabulously unpredictable and individuals. And I think that gets lost a lot in the reporting.
So I think this is highly fascinating. And again, there's like a lot that you've touched upon. So let me maybe try to sort of like unpack that all of it.
So I'm not focused, which I am not.
I was not saying that.
Very, very polite. I'm saying that.
So I'm not focused either. I'll try. So I think what you said, which is really important, I just wanted to highlight it again, is that we're seeing the intent, the political intent, the policy intent that's ultimately behind this is of basically sort of to keep going, right? To make sure that there's long-term stability and long-term economic growth and development, but also there's long-term, of course, political stability, and the two go hand in hand. So let's maybe, and I think that we can sort of establish as that's the key driver behind. Now, there are a bunch of narratives or explanations floating around and sort of on, let's say, sort of the vectors on how that's being done, and sort of how we can interpret all these things that are floating around, from cracking down on tech companies to issuing new regulations to essentially wiping out entire industries overnight. And I just wanted to sort of get a little bit your sense of, they're probably all of these explanations have a bit of truth in it, but I would love for you to hear sort of where you think, which one is actually sort of the most to it, or where we can see it. So one is, which you also touch upon, is this is essentially, it's an antitrust operation, right? So we had these large companies, we all know, the Tencents and the Alibabas, they don't just have like one area, they're everywhere. They have these super apps that basically, you can run your life on in China, more or less. And there was a concern, as there is in other places around the world as well, that these tech companies were just getting too big, too influential. It was actually not good for the economy, that it would hamper innovation, growth of new companies. They would not be good for the consumers. So let's go in and break them up. And the only difference between China and everybody else is that they actually just went ahead and did it, whereas everybody else is just talking about it. So this is one sort of like the antitrust argument, where you could just argue, this is just good governance, right? This is what the government is supposed to be doing. We have some good regulation, we'll shake up the place. The second argument, which I find interesting, even though it doesn't fully convince me, is that there's a little bit of an industrial policy side to it, that the Chinese government feels that while the tech industry is great, it would prefer to have a little less apps and a little bit more semiconductors for reasons that I guess are obvious, right? That's just something that China lacks. Is a semiconductor industry. So the argument is like, if we hit like on one side of the industry, maybe that will shift the focus on another. And there again, the question is, will that actually, does it work like that? And then the third, which is one that's been going around in the last weeks as well, is that it's ultimately about data sovereignty. So that China is, that sort of this flows from the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and the government is wanting to control as much data as they can, because they're, that will give them the tools to control society in all its aspects. So they're also trying to ensure that data doesn't flow outwards. And that's sort of a third vector. Now, if we look at these three sort of like high level explanations, which one do you think sort of gets closest to the truth? Which one would you highlight first?
Well, as I said, there are some reasons why these three resonate.
Yeah.
And one thing we should take a step back, look at again, to try and understand the psyche of the party, is the increasing focus on what's called the dual circulation economy.
Yeah.
So China, if you're in Zhongnanhai now, or in politics there, you basically see a turbulent world outside China's borders, literally on its borders in some cases. I mean, think about obviously Afghanistan and elsewhere, but more generally, the US-China friction, of course, has disrupted supply chains, but particularly in technology, right? That by intent, the US is looking at in areas like semiconductors, not just the chips, but the capital equipment that make the chips and so on, of interrupting or frustrating, China's rise in this tech world for its own reasons. So there is an idea to build this dual circulation economy. This is increasingly a almost hermetically sealed consumer economy within China. We see the rise of certain brands, but also we see the rise of technology companies that are favored. And as you said, this is often more hard tech, let's call them, or deep tech companies. China is investing massive amounts in AI and quantum. Chips is really the Achilles heel at this point, because they're not there. Huawei has been very much hobbled as a company by interruption of chip supplies and equipment supplies to it. So that's definitely addresses some of your points, that this outer economy, or this second circulation, is the global market. So China's still going to supply and trade with the rest of the world, but they're increasingly looking at how to decouple, which is the word on both sides, right? So that does feed that sense of if there's something frivolous which is linked to the outer circle, let's get rid of it, or let's replace it. So, and we should also say, by the way, it's not just fear. There's increasing confidence, because China, from Zhongnanhai, again, you would have seen the last year of, frankly, chaos in the West in terms of the pandemic and its management. Of course, China has still a zero case management. I mean, I could pretty much enjoy a normal life there with the help of some apps, QR codes. So there is a sense of confidence that the government is preying on, as well as a sense of insecurity. So that does speak to, I think, at least the second, third of your point. The first one again was third was data. Second was
second was industrial policy, and the first one was antitrust.
So antitrust also, if the government sees an opportunity to exploit frustration from certainly some merchants who were selling on, say, Alibaba and JD and others, there was this unwritten, although they deny it, policy of arsheng, like if you sell with us, you don't sell to the other guy. It's kind of monopolistic behavior. It's interesting, because why we all love the apps that we use, even if we sometimes resent them, is there is the network effect. The fact that we're on platform A and not platform, Z, is because we know that more people are on A. And so this is a disconnect really between our interests as consumers to have the most widely used, to use Google, to advertise on Google, rather than some other platform. But this does create, the European Commission and others have looked at this over the years. How do you, restrict? Chinese government doesn't have any hesitation about taking on these platforms, if particularly it's generating frustration for consumers. I don't know how much consumer frustration there has been in China. Frankly, as a consumer, and I'm half Scottish, I love the crazy discounts that I was getting on food delivery and free bikes, and but the Chinese government is actually now concerned about waste, excessive capital going into these more frivolous seeming things. So there is an argument for them to say, we are actually protecting your long-term interest.
If we stay for a moment also with the perspective of the Chinese government, so I think there's always this theory that the Chinese government has like long-term plans, and they certainly do. Specifically here, how much of a concerted effort is this? So by the time that the Alipay IPO was sort of abruptly canceled, was it already clear that what is happening now was going to happen? Is this like a long-term plan? Was it already always in the cards, or is this also something that, are they responding to something?
Right. So I think the seeds of Alipay's troubles go back to the early way in which Jack Ma, took control of that company, as I mentioned, kind of playing off the regulators. So there were people who had it in for him for a long time, right? But they never were sufficiently in a position of authority to do something like this. We understand, we don't know, but this issue of stopping the Alipay or IPO went all the way to the top. And it was presented almost on a silver platter, like, look, for all these reasons, you need to act, and act. They did. So then the question is, how can you escalate? How can individual ministries factions escalate their frustrations. Now, because we have a much stronger, frankly, more activist government compared to the more laissez-faire, let's say, Hu Jintao or Zhang, it is more possible, I think, to get your frustrations acted on. And another thing we didn't mention, which is August 17th speech of Xi Jinping about common prosperity, because China has by far one of the highest income inequality ratios in the world. I mean, you can see them, I used to see them walking around Zurich, denuding the shops of luxury. And luxury, by the way, had been hit. I mean, the day after the speech, I think 6, 7, 8% drops in the shares of global luxury companies who are almost 50% dependent on China. I think by 2025, it's basically half of world luxury demand. So anyway, that's another issue. If you're in a sector, if you're investing in a sector which is seen to be out of step, you need to think about risk tolerance there. You can't not invest if you're investing in luxury and you don't invest in China, but you've got to think carefully. And so from the government standpoint, they will now see opportunities to step in and enforce new rules in ways that they never could before. But there's still we clearly see some discussions between different factions. 2 weeks ago, there was a very strong piece that came out that was retweeted around or published in Chinese social media and official media, which is using language which was very leftist to the point of almost being echoing Cultural Revolution. It's quite violent sort of. And then we've seen speeches saying, well, we're not here to scare entrepreneurs. We value the private sector. So at the early stage of this campaign, it didn't seem to be very coordinated. And there still seem to be some rumblings. We don't know. But I think the intent is clear that if it's popular for the government to take on things they haven't taken on before, they will.
So we talked about the intent a lot. Let's briefly also talk about the consequences, maybe the unintended consequences. Before we do that, just a quick reminder also to the online audience that if you do have questions already, you can post them at any time in the Q&A box. That will help us to then shape the debate. So we're going to be turning to audience questions soon. But so we see all this, and the Chinese government has a plan. We're not sure what exactly the plan is and how sort of well planned it is, but there seems to be a plan. But there's also, looking at all this, sort of one can't help but think, this is going to have consequences. Some of these consequences are not going to be good. You've mentioned entrepreneurs; they may have a certain appetite for risk, but that appetite may also, be limited. So investors may think twice before they put their money into Chinese tech companies. A lot of these entrepreneurs, a lot of these investors. Can you talk a little bit about the mood? Is there, do you anticipate this actually dampening sort of the Chinese tech frenzy that we've seen for the last years?
The government is saying no, and they're saying that some of these behaviors, that were in need of correction. So that entrepreneur, and whether it was market dominance or unethical behavior. So there's a lot of talk about ethical, more community spirit behavior, including in areas which appeals to critics in the West about the power of algorithms. Right? We know how algorithms left to their own devices can have unintended consequences. Algorithms in search can be racist, or they can be exclusionary, or So to some extent, the Communist Party is, addressing some of the issues that the world is facing with about the fear of big tech, or So, I think I wouldn't underestimate the levels of support that do exist in society for some of this. And entrepreneurs, of course, are going to say, that was never me, I'm this now. And a big trend we've seen is massive charitable donations coming from some of the leaders of these companies, or even individuals stepping down, stepping back, like Pinduoduo founder stepping back, giving $1 billion. Share prices sometimes go up if they donate a lot of money, or they go down because they've given too much. It's a strange time for valuing Chinese tech stocks. So I think, again, we shouldn't be naive about the fact that there was growing resentment because of the income gap, or the sense of frustration in their lives of young people, that the power of these companies or the effect it's having on them. And so the government's pretty cleverly kind of playing into that. And the stakes are so high that there will always truly be entrepreneurs who want to say, look, I'm different, I'm going to go for this sector. And there are opportunities arising from this crackdown. Of course, the very large players have been told to stop being so dominant, stop buying companies, stop, in the past, that was an exit route. If you're an entrepreneur, you could sell your company to Tencent, Alibaba. Maybe now you've got to think about a longer term strategy, but maybe you're seeing opportunities opening up to you. So it's a mixed bag. I think it was Lenin who said, if they announced tomorrow that all capitalists would be hung 50% would be bidding tonight for the rope contract. So, there's always an opportunity in this stuff. I don't think it's that extreme, but I think that the government's intent is increasingly clear, and it wasn't clear at the beginning, how serious this was. I think now people are realizing. By the way, a lot of the entrepreneurs we talk about, some of them are fabulously wealthy. They assets around the world. They probably live around the world. There's a new generation of entrepreneurs very keen to take over, right? And frustrated with these people. And, so there's an inevitable element of, if you made your money 15 years ago and you look at today and you think, oh, those were the golden years. That's probably true. But, who's coming next?
Yeah. So what you're saying is also that, even within sort of this space of Chinese tech entrepreneurs, sympathy with, the Jack Ma's and the Pinduoduo founders is kind of limited.
I mean, it's mixed. I mean, I think there's, amongst all entrepreneurs, does Musk really like Bezos? No, but the difference is that they can have their commercial fights without worrying about Washington, stepping in. So it's like three-dimensional chess is the way to think about it. I mean, they have to be very careful, their position with their customers, society, with government. It's a very nuanced game to be a leading tech figure in China today. Yeah.